In the next chapter, we will not discuss any decisions based on tactical indications or motive recognition, but here we have to take a decision, well, according to exchanging pieces or not to exchange pieces, or, well, let's say positional kind of decisions, which are also very crucial, and sometimes they can, well, really eventually result in a better or in a worse position when you decide here in a wrong way. The following position actually is a kind of theoretical line, but sometimes you happen to come in such a position without knowing the theory. And just imagine you face this position, your opponent plays the move knight e5, and suddenly you have to decide what to do about your knight on g6. To take it, to allow the capture, to move it to f4, to h4, or to h8. A lot of decision making, well, for the first exercise on chapter 3. But before we actually decide about those two knights, maybe it's good to look a little bit in the position and to see what's going on. We can see that black faces the bishop pair. What do we know about the bishop pair? We know that the bishop pair is very strong when the diagonals are open. Here we see that especially the bishop on c8 is a sort of sorrel child, because that bishop doesn't have right now any perspectives. So what we should ask ourselves before we take any decision on those two knights, what to do in future about our bishop. That could help us in order to understand the reaction which needs to be taken here in a better way. The bishop on c8 has to develop eventually, otherwise we cannot connect the rooks. Otherwise, well, the whole harmony of pieces will not work out. For the development of this bishop, we have, well, three diagonals. We have a6, f1, we have a8, h1, and we have c8, h3. Objectively speaking, we can see that the diagonal a6, f1 is not very attractive because the pawn on d3 is actually a quite rough pawn, and it's of course not well, ideal to believe that our opponent will help us to open up this diagonal. The next diagonal we have is a8, h1. So with the bishop on b7, we may fantasize about playing c4, giving up a pawn, then playing c5, opening up the diagonal, and then eventually have our bishop take part in the game. But objectively speaking, why do we want to sacrifice to make it possible and not even knowing whether then the compensation is good enough? That leaves us to the diagonal c8, h3. In order to open up that diagonal, we need the move d6, e5. This already gives us great information about these two guys, because, well, we know that in order to make our bishop play, we should manage to play d6 and e5. d6 itself will never be a problem because he will not be able to prevent it. The move e5, however, this could be something white will be able to play against, because white only needs to bring the pawn to g3 and to f4 to prevent eventually e5. This is a very useful information because we know that in this position also knight h4 and knight f4 were candidate moves. But now we see that both these moves would help white to fulfill his target in a better way, to play g3 with a tempo, attacking one of the knights, and then pushing f4. So the first thing actually we should watch out is, or we should analyze, is to take on e5, because that for most of you would be the easiest solution, because after bishop takes e5 we manage to play d6 with the tempo. Let's say bishop g3 or b2, it doesn't really matter, we play e5, and here we believe, okay, the bishop is solved, he will be able to develop, we can try to push a5, maybe then a4, and everything is fine. Looking a little bit deeper into the position, we realize that after a5 white will be able to block with a4. So for this reason we will not be able to open up something here. Also, the move e4 in order to open the position is far from realistic because, okay, white is too well prepared. So we see that in this position we solve our problems, but we don't get any kind of dynamic, well, way of playing it. So that means that knight takes e5 is a solution which is maybe like okay, but it's not a perfect solution. And also here there is a rule, maybe not most of you know it. The rule says that if you play with a bishop pair, especially in the middle game, then often it's good to keep one knight on the board. And here in this position, just imagine there would be an extra pair of knight on the board, the dynamic factors would be totally different. But still, it's a useful kind of guide to know this rule, because that makes already the move knight takes e5 a bit less attractive. So we checked now knight takes e5. Let's check first of all the move knight h4 just to see what white is doing. But we already know white will play g3, knight f5 and f4. We are able to push d6, but latest, let's say after knight f3, it's clear that e5 will never be possible without, well, giving up everything, especially your pawn structure in the center. So that's why it's quite easy now to rule out knight h4. Knight f4 looks also like a way more attractive, because now after g3 at least knight a3 check should be analyzed, and many of you may think that this is actually the best solution, because after king g2 it's clear that we are able to take the pawn either with the rook or the knight. But also this, unfortunately, you have to calculate before taking a decision about going to f4. If rook takes f2, giving up a piece, then after king takes h3, I don't see enough compensation, because, okay, you can play d6 with the idea of e5, but here I have a very nice Zwischenzug with knight e4. Let's say the rook has to move, doesn't matter where, let's say f8, then simply knight f3. You can give a check, king g2, and you can play bishop g4. But, well, a move like knight e2, in my opinion, will solve the issue. Like, white will remain with an extra piece. And here I don't see any benefits in this regard. The strongest defense, however, here would be rook e3. So that means that the sacrifice actually is not ideal, or it's not what black should do in order to fight for something. The other option, instead of rook takes f2, is knight takes f2. Looks more appealing because we attack the queen, so the queen needs to be moving, and then one may think that d6 would solve the issue because the knight should move. I play e5 and I have h3 and g4 available for my knight. Unfortunately, the automatism in calculations is always like a big enemy, because nobody would actually expect that after a move like d6 to move away the knight is the only possibility here. And unfortunately it's not, because instead of moving the knight, rook f1 is much stronger, because now the knight doesn't have any squares, and if you take on e5, I take on f2, and I don't think that we need to evaluate this position deeply. We see that black's pawn structure is a disaster and white should have clear positional advantage, and for this reason actually also knight f4, which looks very attractive, is not a solution. Well, we didn't check yet the move d6, but we already know that the capture on g6 is not ideal, because we would like to keep the knight on the board. Moreover, we can agree that this pawn structure is not very good. It also runs to moves like queen g4, and actually, ideal is something else. So, finally speaking, this leaves only one move, and this move is knight h8. And knight h8 here is the strongest move in this position. And even if you may not believe me, because it looks absolutely retarded, just click on the engine and you will see that after knight h8 he gives advantage for black. But the reason is very simple. Now, if white plays g3, he is too late, because he doesn't attack any of our knights. We can push d6, and if the knight goes, for example, to c4, we have e5. We opened up our bishop as we wanted to, but we have an extra knight on the board, which gives perfect chances to come up with a kind of king side attack, besides the white squares are very weak. If, for example, after d6, knight e4 is played, which is given here in the analyze, it doesn't really matter. We will push e5, and after something like rook e4, we can play knight f7, and well, knight g5 is coming, and we can see that black has huge play. So eventually, how to understand that knight h8 is the best move and to take the right decision here, of course, you should, well, consider, or you should at least look into the future of your position. You should see what you need to achieve and what not. And before the question arises what to do and how to decide, you should ask yourself what to do about every other piece. What is the general plan of this position? Which pieces I need to keep in the game, which pieces are not good to keep in the game. And only after all these questions you ask to yourself, you will be able to maybe find out what to do here. And we can agree that knight h8 is not an easy move, but after all what we analyzed here together, it becomes yet quite obvious.